Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where I should probably close this thing. Hold on, give me a second. Okay. Wow. Now we're really in the dark. Hold on, give me another second. Sorry, folks. You can hum along to the tune of your choosing. This is a lo-fi show. Um, but we talk a lot about hi-fi music and a lot of very interesting musical concepts that relate to it. Okay, that's as good as it's going to get. Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box. And like many music fans, many musicians, many people who just love thinking about music and listening to it, I'm still sort of reeling from the sad death of Brian Wilson, the heart, soul, and mind of the Beach Boys, which isn't to take away from the great contributions of other band members. I think that we should celebrate them as well, especially the late Carl Wilson and the late Dennis Wilson. Now, I started to think about this sort of concept of what was the Beach Boys after the Beach Boys? And it's a bit misleading because of all of the major bands that came out in the 60s, the Beach Boys, along with the Rolling Stones, lasted the longest with much of their original lineup intact until several tragic deaths made that difficult. First Dennis in the 80s, then Carl in the 90s, then Brian Wilson earlier this month. But the Beach Boys had a long run, and the albums that followed Pet Sounds that sometimes get short shrift from critics and fans alike, those bear a lot of closer examination because there were some really good albums. A lot of people point to Smiley Smile as a lost opportunity, but there was some interesting dissonant stuff on there, some avant-garde stuff, and there were some great tunes. Heroes and Villains, for instance, was a great tune. While Good Vibrations was written earlier, they stuck it on the album, and that could be called a quintessential Beach Boys song. Wild Honey and Friends were very good albums. And I would say that of the sort of post Pet Sounds albums released in the 60s, definitely check out the 2020 album. It is a hidden gem. And by that, I mean, if people talk about the sort of forgotten, the long lost Smile project and try to sort of extract musical genius out of Smiley Smile because of that. And Smiley Smile is a pretty decent album, but 2020, I would say, is even more cohesive. And there's some great tracks on there. Sunflower also has some really good tracks. This Whole World, Slip On Through, really good stuff. And another one that is probably the best album of the 70s that the Beach Boys put out is Surf's Up. It's well produced, has some great songwriting. And yes, the title track was actually part of the Smile sessions. And that, I think, is one of Brian Wilson's all time great tracks. But there are other great tracks on that album, too. Till I Die is a great one. Free Flows, which I believe is a Carl Wilson composition, really, really good stuff as well. The album Holland, also from the 70s, that was from around 73. That doesn't get enough credit for being a truly, really good album, if you ask me. Sail On Sailor, for instance, being a very good song indeed. But a lot of people um, will continue to cling on to the myth that the Beach Boys sort of fizzled out after Pet Sounds, or at least after Smiley Smile, or the ones who are being a bit more revisionist will say, oh, they fizzled out after Surf's Up. Well, okay, I get why they're saying it, because for much of the early 70s, while Brian was writing music, he was withdrawn from a lot of, certainly public touring, and Carl was in charge in the studio. Not bad thing, a much better guitar player than people give him credit for, and of course, an angelic voice. I would argue that of all the many great voices in the Beach Boys, whether Brian's himself, whether the great Mike Love, not necessarily the easiest guy to work with, according to some, but yeah, he had a great voice and was a great songwriter. Al Jardine had a great voice, Bruce Johnston when he came in as well. But Carl Wilson, for me, was the ultimate vocalist from a band that prided itself on everyone being able to sing and to create the best harmonies that anyone had really ever heard in that context. But let's just accept the mythology that sort of by the late 60s, the Beach Boys were past their prime. I don't accept it, but a lot of people do. And the greatest hits compilations are, they kind of speak for themselves. Most of it is from Pet Sounds or before. And you do have to admit that in some ways, the Beach Boys were victims of their own success because they had such a tremendous musical run in the early and mid 60s that it was sort of like when you've reinvented the wheel, where do you go from there? So let's imagine thinking of artists who will be successors to the Beach Boys. And let's look at the elements of what made the Beach Boys who they are. The most sort of strident and the most sort of obvious of all of the things that happened uh, to the music scene derived from the Beach Boys was the harmony. The way that they approached harmony, that specific sound of the harmony, bringing earlier influences like Barbershop Quartet and like the Four Freshmen, who were a huge influence on Brian Wilson, bringing them into the sort of modern sounds. That was a huge thing, and you can feel it in a band that isn't necessarily linked to the Beach Boys in any way, shape, or form, not least since their lyrical matter is generally much darker than certainly anything dealt with in the early Beach Boys catalog. And this is Pink Floyd. Now, Pink Floyd in their golden 70s era made a very good, I would say, use of backing vocalists. And on their albums Dark Side of the Moon and Wish You Were Here, this was accomplished by female backing vocalists who tended to have a sort of soulful approach to music. One female backing vocalist, Claire Torrey, even got to sort of star on a lyricless song written by Richard Wright, The Great Gig in the Sky, because the whole lead vocal part was just her singing without lyrics. And of course, on Wish You Were Here, that album, on the track Shine On You Crazy Diamond, lots of great female vocals, backing vocals. But I would say that those vocals were an implicit part of those albums. And if you ever get to hear the Alan Parsons quadraphonic mix of Dark Side of the Moon, or the subsequent, Parsons didn't do this one, another engineer did, his name saves me, but the very good quadraphonic mix of Wish You Were Here, you can really hear just how important to the musical structure those backing female voices were. Um, then you had Animals, and there wasn't so much backing vocal there, but the backing vocals were back with a vengeance by the time they created The Wall. Only this time it was very different. Gone were the female backing vocalists, who later returned to the Dave Gilmour led Pink Floyd. Instead, there was a male vocal harmony group that was consciously styled on the Beach Boys. Now, the old story goes that Roger Waters actually wanted all of the touring members of the Beach Boys to sing on The Wall. In the end, he only got Bruce Johnston, but he was the musical director of the male vocal harmony singers who really gave a unique flavor to that album. And I think that one of the many reasons that that album is so very strong is because you have this contrast between the very dark and heavy musical, lyrical, and ideological themes that Roger Waters poured into that album. You have that contrasted with this male California style harmony, this Beach Boys style male harmony that is really we're programmed for both musical reasons and because of the reasons to do with musical memory. We're programmed to see that as very happy music because, after all of the early Beach Boys stuff generally was very happy. And even their bittersweet ballads, there was something very warm and comforting about them. And so there is that. And then, though, there's the person who probably both consciously and unconsciously had more to do with being the Beach Boys after, in quotes, the Beach Boys than anyone else. And this was Todd Rundgren. And this is something that I actually never knew that Todd talked about, but he did, because I was listening to lots of Beach Boys over the past couple of weeks, and I was thinking, well, what else do I like that this reminds me of? And suddenly, sort of early to mid 70s Todd Rundgren songs popped into my mind. And when it comes to Todd, I would say that the thing that influenced him most wasn't necessarily the harmonies that Roger Waters and Pink Floyd ran with, but it was the wonderful chordal development, the chord changes, and the interesting use of chords that you didn't really hear in pop music all that much before Brian Wilson. And Todd Rundgren took a lot of those chords and took it that much further. The Mike Martz to his Don Coryell, if you will. Not many people watching this will get that reference. Maybe some will. But when you listen to Todd Rundgren, it makes so much sense, because one of the things that I've always loved about Todd's music is his ability to do such interesting things with chords. He can do with chords what very few could. And his approach to music in general, a lot of people put him in that prog rock category. He had a prog rock band, if you will, Utopia. He was a multi-instrumentalist. He wrote long suites of music that were marketed to rock audiences, all traditional hallmarks of what we would refer to as prog rock. But I would really say that compared to a lot of the sort of traditional prog rock bands that were very neoclassically influenced, like Genesis, yes, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, to King Crimson, who was sort of a mix of neoclassical in the early days, and then they become very Eurocentric avant-garde. I would say Todd Rundgren was very different than any of that. In fact, his music wasn't as European, as classical as those other bands that I mentioned. It was much more about modern American harmonic composition, which is something that Brian Wilson, along with a lot of great arrangers and songwriters of the 60s, brought to the table. You could say that Jimmy Webb had a huge influence on modern American songwriting and modern American harmony and chords. I would say that probably in terms of songwriters, I would say it was Brian Wilson and Jimmy Webb. And in terms of arrangers, but Brian Wilson did most of his own arrangements. And then you had people like Gordon Jenkins and Don Costa who were doing really avant-garde stuff, even on very mainstream, dare I say, old school albums. They were putting in a lot of very modern harmonic sensibilities on the albums in the 1960s that they were orchestrating, that they were arranging. And I hear all of this in a lot of early Todd Rundgren music. A lot of people point to his album A Wizard, a True Star as sort of the height of Todd going Beach Boys, but I hear it in many of his albums. I hear it on the album that's just called Todd. I hear it on the Initiation album. I even hear it in quite a lot of the early Utopia stuff, which came around the mid 70s when he formed a band. Utopia was a band as opposed to his solo albums that were literally solo in the literal sense of the word. It was just Todd. Now, I thought maybe I'm crazy, maybe I'm hearing things, but sure enough, I looked into it, and in a not that old interview, Todd Rundgren actually says that he was very influenced by the Beach Boys and by Brian Wilson's composition in particular. And one of the things he said, which really stuck with me, is that is that what Brian Wilson did is he made wonderful music, great songwriting based around chords as opposed to riffs. And that itself was something of a departure from a lot of the rock and roll based pop music, not only of the 50s, not only of the 60s, but most rock and pop music. A lot, you can write a riff and base a song around a riff that is a great song. Smoke on the Water, possibly the best riff song ever. One of the simplest but most fantastic riff songs ever, The Knack, My Sharona. Bum, 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 bum. We all know it. But it does take more, I would say, either more effort or more intuitive genius to write something that is chordally sophisticated, whether or not it has a strong riff. And this is frankly true in almost every Brian Wilson composition, from the very, very early stuff through Pet Sounds to Smile to his songs that were released in the 70s during his more reclusive years, but when he was still capable of composing really good songs. And a lot of this rubbed off on the other Beach Boys, Carl in particular. A lot of his songs, you hear a lot of his brother in that. Mike Love, I would say, it was a bit like, they could a bit of yin and yang with Brian, but again, that's why at least in the early and middle period, Mike and Brian collaborated so very well. So when you listen to Todd Rundgren, you hear some of the dissonance and using the studio as an instrument that you heard on Smile, and of course the studio as an instrument technique that was pioneered on Pet Sounds right at the same time Zappa was doing Freak Out. But again, more than anything, it really is the chords. Now, I looked at some other articles and interviews of Todd from earlier, and like any young musician, you don't want to be pigeonholed into being the next version of this or that. Some bands didn't mind it. I think ELO liked being called the next Beatles by a lot of important people. Genesis loved when John Lennon said, "Who needs the Beatles when you've got Genesis?" He said that about their Selling England by the Pound album. But Todd, like most musicians, wanted to be his own man. He hated that his Something Anything album was compared to Carole King, and he didn't like that A Wizard of True Star was compared to Brian Wilson, although he later admitted what I said just a minute ago about how Brian Wilson's chordal developments and techniques were really such a huge part of what Todd was doing. And so in many ways, you can look at the Beach Boys as, yes, they inspired the experimentation of British and European progressive rock, but I think it would be more helpful to think of Brian Wilson as someone who changed American songwriting from something that was very much jazz influenced, Great American Songbook influenced, to something that, yes, had a rock and roll idiom, but unlike the traditional rock or folk or country and western based singer-songwriters, his modern sense of what I would call this American chordal songwriting technique that I would credit Brian Wilson with kind of inventing. You hear it in the mature music of Jimmy Webb, things like MacArthur Park, things like Wichita Lineman, things like Galveston, things like By the Time I Get to Phoenix. You hear it in Todd Rundgren in his extended pieces and all over these sort of early and middle period albums. And it then, obviously, the harmony influenced others, but when it comes to the chords, Jimmy Webb, who was sort of at the same era as Brian Wilson, but Brian got his first piece of success before Jimmy Webb. Then you had Todd Rundgren come in. You could call them the three kings of all-American chordal music composition. Wilson as a songwriter and arranger and performer, Jimmy Webb, best known as a songwriter and arranger, and then Todd Rundgren, who took all of those things and put it in a package that kind of felt and smelled like progressive rock, but really was much more akin to Jimmy Webb and the Beach Boys than to Genesis, ELP, and Yes. That, at least, is my take on it. I'd love to know what you think. And in the meantime, listen to all of this stuff that I recommend. I love it. Maybe you'll love it too. Certainly millions do. And of course, rest in peace, rest in power, love and mercy to the wonderful Brian Wilson. Cannot ever say enough about him. Take care.